to grave unnecessary risk. And it's possible to continue using older or homemade devices without protective features. It's also possible to run an electrophoresis device unattended. But none of these are exactly what's meant by practicing safe science. The investigator had gone home for the evening, leaving his gel running. A modern device would have shut off before the buffer evaporated. The experimental work in progress of several investigators was destroyed. The lab was out of service for weeks. Now Anne is ready to take her gel down. Of course, she'll put on gloves before reaching into the bath. What's the most effective practice in using protective gloves? Surprisingly, the answer is B. The most effective practice is to change gloves frequently and when contaminated, because all gloves are permeable to some degree. All gloves are permeable. So whenever you're working with concentrated chemicals or large quantities, you should be wondering how much protection you're getting. For most purposes, the general use gloves are fine, but they have a very fast permeation time, which is why you should be discarding them and putting on fresh ones frequently, whenever they've been in contact with a chemical. When the hazard is greater, you want the greater protection of a glove that's specifically designated for what you're doing.
Safety is planning and organizing and controlling what you're doing, not responding in a rush, not hastily doing something, not thinking about what you're doing. Leads to unsafe things, right? And the best science, the best experiments, the best experimentalists are people who plan everything. They have complete control of their experiment. They know every reagent and how it works. They have it all organized before them. They have a protocol sheet they're going to do, and they're going to follow that protocol sheet, and they systematically work through. And when they put all that protocol and this experimental design together, they incorporate the fundamental good rules of safety. That's the best experimentalist. If you can design your experiments that way, you will be safe.
In a lab where the work involves handling human blood or tissues, the safety issues take on a different complexion, which means you should be thinking about questions like this. What is the risk of hepatitis B virus infection for lab workers relative to the general population? Two to 7 times as high. But the good news is that you can essentially eliminate the risk by being vaccinated and using good laboratory practices. And speaking of good lab practices, if your work involves handling human blood or tissues, grade yourself on whether you are 100% consistent about doing each of these important safety steps. Making sure all glassware and other disposables are appropriately decontaminated before washing. Disposing of all contaminated materials according to the regulations of your host institution. Keeping your wits about you when disposing of sharps so they don't end up someplace where they'll be a hazard for the housekeeping staff. Washing your hands thoroughly when finished, even though you've been wearing gloves. Conventional wisdom says we tend to grow careless about routine things, like wearing the lab coat and avoiding shorts or open-toed shoes, while using all due caution about the major hazards. So this should be easy. Which laboratory accidents involving blood-borne pathogens can cause infection? Inoculation and a splash onto mucous membranes or broken skin are the primary laboratory hazards. Infection by aerosols is unlikely. But of course, there's more to lab safety than just knowing the hazards.
Anyone who screws up with TB threatens the life of everybody else in the lab. And everyone knows that, so that the need for consideration is the most serious and important thing we have to worry about. Much less concerned, for example, that if someone spills bugs or has an accident, we can deal with that. We know how to deal with that. Most concern is that if there is an accident and someone is afraid to report that, feels that they'll be punished or severely criticized, then that completely decimates the whole cooperative spirit of the lab and puts everybody at risk. So the challenge has been to have everybody participate.
Our final category, the kinds of accidents that are not related to a specific protocol. Many accidents happen away from the workbench, especially when you're transporting something. But if the containers are sealed or are in secondary containers, it's not a big problem to drop, bump, or bounce them. Accidents happen when what you're doing is so routine or familiar, you take it for granted. When you're thinking about other things, distracted, not focused. When you're in a hurry, under stress, or just not paying attention. Those are the times you should be shifting into high caution. Thinking about where the risks are. Making your actions deliberate. Accidents happen when you're doing some dull task that doesn't require any brain power. Accidents happen when you're doing everything by the book and something stupid takes you by surprise. And they happen when you're excessively fatigued.
When you're too exhausted, you're not thinking about what you're doing, so you're very likely to mix the tubes. You're very likely not to follow the protocol. So it is also bad for an experiment to do things in a hasty way or an exhausted way. It doesn't work because you're not alert.
I regard safety as intimately related to good laboratory practice and simple consideration for other people in the lab.
There is nothing inconsistent between a well-done experiment and a safe experiment. And in fact, they almost have to go hand in hand, because if you don't have the control to do a safe experiment, you're not doing the experiment right.
No reason, whatever way, you can't do good science safely.